The auditorium was already standing when the screen behind my father flickered. Applause. Camera lights. That low hum of a crowd waiting to be told what to feel. Then the wall appeared. Names, dates, contributions, and there it was. Mine. The room didn't react at first, but my father did. He stopped mid-sentence, his smile locked in place. And in that silence I knew this moment was going to end something we'd spent decades pretending was unbreakable. Before I tell you how we got here, you need to understand the rules of our family. I grew up in a family where honor was spoken about the way some families talk about faith, constantly, reverently, and without room for questioning. My father believed honor was something you declared out loud, something you displayed in public, until people repeated it back to you. He believed reputation was a shield, that if enough people admired you, no one would look too closely at how things actually worked behind the scenes. From the outside, we were admired. People spoke his name with respect. He sat on boards, chaired committees, gave speeches about service, sacrifice, and unity. Our family was often used as an example: how to raise children, how to stay together, how to do things the right way. Inside the house, though, the rules were quieter and far more rigid. The first rule was loyalty, and loyalty meant alignment. You didn't contradict the public version of events. You didn't correct him in front of others. You didn't ask questions that made people uncomfortable. If something felt unfair, you were expected to reframe it as discipline. If something hurt, you were expected to call it character building. And if you benefited in any way from the family name, access, opportunity, stability, you were expected to repay that debt with silence. My father didn't yell much. He didn't need to. His control came from disappointment, from the way he could withdraw approval without raising his voice. Praise was currency, attention was leverage, and affection was conditional, though never explicitly stated. I learned early how to read the room, how to anticipate what version of myself was required in each setting. At school events, I was the grateful child. At family gatherings, the respectful one. At public functions, the quiet extension of his legacy. Boundaries weren't discussed in our household, because boundaries implied separation, and separation implied disloyalty. Everything was collective. Decisions were framed as what's best for the family, even when the cost was individual. Privacy didn't really exist. Stories were shared without permission, achievements were presented as shared victories, and mistakes were quietly absorbed into the narrative, so long as they didn't disrupt the image. As I got older, I noticed how often my father spoke about ownership, of ideas, of outcomes, of people's roles. He didn't see it as control. He saw it as stewardship. He genuinely believed that because he had built something respected, he had the right to manage how it was used, including the people attached to it. I didn't question this for a long time. When you're raised inside a system like that, you don't immediately recognize it as a system. It just feels normal. You tell yourself every family has rules, every parent has expectations. You confuse structure with safety. And because there was no single dramatic moment of harm, no explosive incident that forced clarity, everything blurred together into something harder to name. I carried pride in my family, alongside a quiet, persistent sense of unease I couldn't fully articulate. I felt like my life was slightly out of alignment, like I was always standing half a step behind where I actually was. Still, I believed in responsibility. I believed in contribution. I believed that if you were part of something bigger, you did your part without complaint. That belief made it easy to dismiss early discomfort. When my father spoke on stages about sacrifice, I nodded along. When people congratulated me for being part of such a respected family, I accepted it. I didn't yet understand how often my name was being used as reinforcement, as evidence of unity, as a symbol rather than a person. And I certainly didn't understand that the very values I was taught to honor, integrity, accountability, service, would eventually be the reason I could no longer stay silent. At that point in my life, I still believed the system worked, because it always had. I believed the rules existed to protect us. What I didn't know then was that those same rules were quietly being used to move things in my name without my knowledge, and that by the time I started to sense something was wrong, the paper trail had already begun. The first sign that something was wrong didn't arrive with confrontation or accusation, but with a tone so polite, it almost disappeared into the background of my day. It was an email, brief and professional, thanking me for my continued support and acknowledging a recent contribution made in my name. I remember rereading it twice, not because it was alarming, but because it didn't line up with my memory. I hadn't made a contribution. The amount wasn't large, which made it easier to dismiss. And the organization itself was familiar, one my father had spoken about often. I assumed it was a clerical mistake, the kind that happens when names are similar or databases overlap. And for a moment I felt more embarrassed than concerned, as if I had forgotten an obligation, rather than discovered something misattributed. I didn't respond right away. I flagged the email and went on with my day, telling myself I would sort it out later. A week passed, then another message arrived, this one from a different organization, again thanking me for support, again referencing my name with confidence. That was when the unease started to take shape. 2 unrelated errors felt unlikely, but still the pattern wasn't loud enough to demand action. I mentioned it casually to my father during a phone call, careful to keep my tone light, almost joking, as if I were sharing a minor inconvenience rather than raising a concern. He laughed, the kind of easy laugh that signals the conversation isn't meant to go any deeper, and said it was probably just a mix-up, that sometimes it was easier for organizations to bundle family contributions together, rather than list each person separately. He said my name being associated with good work wasn't something I should worry about, and that if anything, I should feel proud. I remember the pause after he said that, the subtle expectation that I would agree, that the conversation would end there. Instead, I said calmly that I'd prefer my name not be used without my knowledge, that I like to keep my finances and affiliations clean and separate. The shift was immediate, though quiet. His tone cooled. He didn't argue, but he reminded me, gently and deliberately, of everything the family had done for me over the years, of the opportunities that came with our shared reputation, of how being part of something larger sometimes meant accepting decisions you didn't personally make. He framed it as practicality, not control. Efficiency, not entitlement. I told myself he had a point. I told myself this was normal, that families operate this way all the time, that pushing back over something so small would be petty. Still, I followed up with the organizations directly, asking for clarification. Careful not to accuse, careful not to create waves. The responses were friendly, reassuring, and vague. According to their records, my name was associated with a family account. According to their files, the contributions were authorized. Each answer left me with more questions than before, but also with the growing awareness that my name existed in places I hadn't placed it. Over the next few months, similar messages appeared intermittently, never frequent enough to feel urgent, never significant enough to trigger alarms. Each one, however, added weight. I started paying closer attention, scanning correspondence more carefully, noticing how often my father referenced our contributions, were the family's support, when speaking publicly, occasionally glancing at me as if to confirm alignment. I didn't confront him again right away. Part of me still believed there was a misunderstanding I hadn't fully grasped, that once clarified, everything would resolve quietly. Another part of me recognized the familiar pattern: minimize, rationalize, maintain the story. The boundary I had tried to set wasn't ignored outright, it was absorbed, reinterpreted, and overridden in the name of unity. And while nothing about the situation felt explosive, nothing felt accidental either. It felt intentional in the way systems are intentional, slow, procedural, built to continue unless actively stopped. I began to sense that if I didn't get clarity soon, whatever was happening in my name would solidify into something much harder to untangle, and that the longer I waited, the more it would be framed as consent rather than confusion. The situation shifted from uneasy to undeniable the morning my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't recognize, a brief alert from my bank flagging an unusual transaction for review. At first glance it looked routine, the kind of automated message designed to reassure more than alarm, but the vendor name stopped me cold. It was one of the same organizations that had sent those earlier thank you emails. The amount was modest, almost intentionally so, small enough to blend into the background of a normal month, but I knew immediately that I hadn't authorized it. I opened my account and scanned the recent activity, feeling that slow tightening in my chest as I realized it wasn't the only unfamiliar charge. There were others, spaced out, varied just enough to avoid patterns, all tied to entities connected to my father's public work. I called the bank, expecting to clear it up quickly, certain there had to be a simple explanation. The representative was calm and thorough, walking me through the entries one by one, confirming dates and reference numbers. When I said I didn't recognize them, there was a pause, then a careful shift in tone. She told me the transactions appeared to be authorized through a linked account structure, one that listed me as an associated contributor rather than a primary holder. I asked how that was possible, how my name could be linked to an account I didn't manage. She explained, using language that sounded rehearsed, that certain family or organizational arrangements allowed for shared authorizations if the documentation supported it. Documentation, the word hung there. I requested copies of whatever forms had been used, not to accuse, but to understand. The bank opened a review and advised me to monitor the account closely in the meantime. When the documents arrived a few days later, I sat at my desk and read them slowly, line by line, the way you read something when you're hoping to be proven wrong. My name was there, typed cleanly. My information accurate down to the smallest detail. And a signature that looked close enough to mine to pass at a glance, but wrong in the way that matters when you know your own hand. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and clarity, as if something I'd been circling for months had finally settled into focus. I didn't confront my father immediately. Instead, I started documenting everything. I downloaded statements. I took screenshots, labeled dates, cross-referenced amounts. Each piece on its own might have been dismissed as an error or oversight, but together they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. I contacted the organizations again, this time more directly, asking how my name had been added, who had submitted the paperwork, what records they kept on file. The responses were polite, professional, and increasingly careful. According to their records, the authorization had been provided by a family representative. According to their records, the forms were complete. According to their records, there had been no reason to question legitimacy. That was when I sought professional advice, not to escalate, but to ground myself in reality. I needed to know whether I was overreacting or finally seeing things clearly. The person I spoke with reviewed the documents without commentary, flipping through pages, checking dates, comparing signatures. When they finished, they didn't dramatize it. They didn't speculate about intent. They simply said that whatever the original justification had been, my name should not have been used without explicit, ongoing consent, and that the cleanest path forward would be formal separation. They warned me gently that situations like this rarely stayed private once recognition and public acknowledgement were involved. Institutions liked visibility. They liked walls, programs, donor lists. Names had momentum once attached. If I wanted control back, I would need to act before the next public event cemented the narrative. That warning lingered with me. I went back through my calendar and realized how many ceremonies, banquets, and presentations were coming up. How often my father was scheduled to speak. How frequently families like ours were highlighted as examples. The pressure wasn't overt, but it was constant, like a low hum beneath everything else. I knew then that this wasn't just about money or paperwork. It was about identity, about who had the right to represent me and under what circumstances. And as much as I wanted to resolve it quietly, I also understood that the longer my name remained attached to actions I hadn't chosen, the harder it would be to claim that separation later. By the time I finished organizing the files on my computer, each labeled and dated, I felt a strange calm settle in. I didn't know exactly how it would end, but for the first time I knew where the truth was documented, and I knew that whatever happened next would no longer rely on someone else's version of events. The event itself was never supposed to include me, which was part of what made the decision to attend feel so deliberate, almost heavy with meaning before anything had actually happened. I remember standing outside the venue for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the muffled sound of voices and music through the doors, steadying my breath as if I were about to step into something irreversible. Inside, the auditorium was washed in warm light, the kind designed to flatter faces and soften edges, and the air carried the faint smell of polished wood and printed programs. People moved with purpose, greeting one another, exchanging practiced smiles, their conversations blending into a low, confident hum. I took a seat toward the middle, not hidden but not prominent either, close enough to see the stage clearly without drawing attention. My father was already there, moving easily through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing, every gesture familiar in the way it always had been. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause came naturally, almost on cue, and he waited just long enough for it to crest before speaking, his voice steady, warm, practiced. He talked about values, about unity, about the importance of honoring family and community, weaving his own story into something larger, something admirable. I watched him the way you watch someone you've known your entire life suddenly, from a distance, noticing the pauses, the emphasis, the way he scanned the room as if confirming that the story was landing exactly where he intended. The presentation shifted smoothly, a technician advancing the program as my father gestured toward the screen behind him, explaining that recognition mattered, that acknowledging support publicly was part of accountability. The screen brightened, and the wall appeared, rows of names arranged carefully, professionally, the kind of display meant to inspire pride. At first, there was no reaction. Names scrolled past, familiar to many in the room, each one accompanied by polite applause or nods of recognition. There was no dramatic sound cue, no spotlight, just text, clean and undeniable. I felt the change before I saw it, the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way conversation stopped a half-second too late. My father's voice faltered, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough that anyone watching closely would notice. He turned slightly, his eyes catching on the screen, his expression freezing in a way I had never seen before, caught between composure and calculation. For a moment, he didn't speak. The applause didn't come. Someone in the front row leaned toward the person beside them, whispering. A camera operator adjusted focus, the faint mechanical whir audible in the quiet. I stayed still, hands folded, heart steady in a way that surprised me. I didn't look around. I didn't look away. I let the moment stand on its own. My father cleared his throat and attempted to continue, but the rhythm was gone. The practiced flow disrupted by something he hadn't anticipated. The screen moved on, other names following mine, but the damage was already done. The story he was telling no longer matched the evidence behind him. When the segment ended, the applause returned, thinner this time, uneven, more out of politeness than enthusiasm. My father finished his remarks quickly, thanked the audience, and stepped away from the podium with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Afterward, in the lobby, conversations were quieter, more measured. A few people glanced at me, then away. Others approached my father with compliments that felt rehearsed, their tone cautious. No one confronted anyone directly. They didn't need to. The public narrative had cracked, not because I spoke, but because the record spoke for me. I left without saying goodbye, the cool night air outside feeling sharper, cleaner than the warmth I'd just stepped out of. As I walked away, my phone vibrated once, then again. Notifications piling up from institutions seeking clarification, from contacts asking careful questions. I didn't answer them yet. I didn't need to. The moment had passed, and in its wake, the truth was no longer contained within our family's private rules. It had stepped onto a stage, briefly and quietly, and that was enough. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle, which in some ways made it more difficult to process, because there was no single moment that signaled resolution, only a series of quiet procedural steps that slowly redefined the shape of my life. Within days of the event, emails began to arrive, their subject lines neutral and professional, requesting clarification, documentation, confirmation of authorization. Institutions don't accuse, they verify, and that distinction mattered. I responded carefully, attaching records, forwarding correspondence, providing timelines, never embellishing, never speculating about intent. I let the facts speak in the measured, impersonal language they required. Banks initiated reviews, temporarily restricting linked access while they assessed the information. Organizations updated their records, some apologizing for the confusion, others simply acknowledging receipt. My name was removed from future materials, my association reclassified, permissions tightened in ways that felt both validating and surreal. It was strange to watch systems adjust so efficiently when for so long I had been told those systems were too complicated to change. The professional validation came quietly, a confirmation call from a representative, explaining that the separation had been completed, that my accounts were now fully independent, that any future use of my name would require explicit, documented consent. There was relief in that finality, but also grief, because closure often arrives carrying the weight of what it closes. My father reached out once, late in the evening, his voice controlled, almost careful, as if choosing each word in real time. He didn't deny what had happened. He didn't apologize either. He asked why I had allowed it to become a public issue, framing the outcome as a failure of discretion, rather than a consequence of choices. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar that framing was, how reflexively he reached for narrative over responsibility. I told him I hadn't made anything public. I told him I had asked, privately and clearly, for my name not to be used. I told him the only thing I had done was stop covering for something that no longer felt right. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that usually preceded either anger or persuasion. This time, neither came. He said he needed time. I said I understood. When the call ended, there was no dramatic sense of victory, no rush of vindication, just a quiet, steady awareness that a boundary had been drawn and recorded, not just emotionally, but officially. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects continued at a manageable distance. Invitations stopped. References to family contributions shifted in tone or disappeared entirely. Mutual contacts adjusted, some pulling back, others offering brief supportive messages that acknowledged change without asking for explanation. I noticed how much energy I had been spending maintaining alignment with a version of myself that no longer existed, and how that energy returned once the expectation lifted. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if a softer approach might have preserved more connection. But each time I returned to the documentation, to the clarity of what had actually occurred, and the doubt settled. Boundaries, I learned, don't erase relationships. They redefine them. Sometimes that redefinition reveals how little space there was to begin with. The official consequences weren't punitive, and they weren't meant to be. They were corrective. They restored ownership where it belonged, and set terms that could be enforced without constant vigilance. That mattered more than any apology. Over time, the quiet became normal. Not empty, just different. I rebuilt routines without factoring in approval or perception, and in doing so, I felt something stabilize inside me. The story I had been raised to protect no longer required my participation, and in stepping away, I didn't lose myself. I found the part of me that had been waiting, patiently, for permission to stand on my own name.